Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight, we gather in that quiet space where philosophy meets daily life, where ancient wisdom illuminates the patterns of our modern minds. We come together not to escape the world, but to understand it more clearly, to see our relationship with fortune and misfortune through eyes refined by Stoic practice. Our subject this evening is one of the most misunderstood techniques in the Stoic tradition: negative visualization. This practice, known to the ancient Romans as premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, has traveled through 20 centuries to reach us. Yet somewhere along that long journey, its meaning has become clouded, its purpose obscured. Many who encounter it today mistake it for something it was never meant to be. They confuse it with worry, with catastrophizing, with the anxious spinning of terrible scenarios that keeps us awake at 3 in the morning, heart racing, mind caught in loops of fear. They hear the phrase negative visualization and imagine themselves deliberately cultivating anxiety, purposefully making themselves miserable. And naturally, they turn away. Why would anyone choose such a practice? Why would the Stoics, those philosophers of tranquility and reason, recommend something that sounds so harmful? But this confusion reveals how far we have drifted from understanding the true nature of this practice. Negative visualization, done right, is not an exercise in anxiety generation. It is not worry dressed in philosophical clothing. It is something far more subtle, far more profound, and far more useful than that common misunderstanding suggests. The distinction matters enormously. The difference between negative visualization and catastrophizing is not merely academic. It is the difference between a practice that cultivates gratitude, resilience, and appreciation, and a mental habit that erodes our peace and accomplishes nothing. Understanding this difference is not just intellectually interesting. It is practically essential for anyone who wishes to live a Stoic life without inadvertently harming themselves. Tonight, we will take our time to understand this practice properly. We will move slowly through its foundations, examining what the ancient Stoics actually taught, how they themselves practiced negative visualization, and why they considered it so valuable. We will distinguish it clearly from worry and anxiety. We will explore how it builds genuine resilience rather than fear. And we will understand how it cultivates deep gratitude without requiring us to lose what we value. This is not a simple topic. It requires nuance, care, and a willingness to see past our initial reactions. The practice itself is subtle. It operates in that delicate space between acknowledgement and attachment, between awareness and anxiety. To understand it is to understand something important about the Stoic view of human life itself. So we begin with patience, with openness, and with the recognition that sometimes the most valuable practices are those that seem paradoxical at first. Sometimes wisdom asks us to look directly at what we would prefer to avoid, not to torment ourselves, but to free ourselves. Sometimes the path to greater peace requires us to acknowledge the impermanence we would rather ignore. The Stoics were not pessimists, despite what casual observers might think. They did not dwell in darkness or cultivate gloom. When we look at the actual lives and writings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, we find men engaged fully with life, serving their communities, maintaining friendships, pursuing excellence in their chosen roles. We find gratitude, not bitterness, engagement, not withdrawal, active participation in the world, not fearful retreat from it. Yet these same philosophers regularly contemplated loss, mortality, and misfortune. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, began many mornings by reminding himself that he would encounter difficult people that day. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, periodically practiced voluntary poverty, sleeping on hard beds and eating simple food. Epictetus, who had been enslaved and knew suffering intimately, taught his students to regularly contemplate the loss of those they loved. Why? Were they masochists? Were they trying to make themselves miserable? Were they so scarred by life that they could not help but expect the worst? No, they were doing something far more sophisticated than that. They were practicing a technique designed to address some of the deepest challenges of human existence. Our tendency toward ingratitude, our shock and devastation when loss occurs, our fragile dependence on things outside our control, and our failure to appreciate what we have until it is gone. The human mind, left to its own devices, adapts quickly to good fortune. We receive a gift and feel delight, but within days or weeks, that gift has become part of the background of our lives. We take it for granted. The new home fills us with joy initially, but soon we notice only its flaws. The relationship that once seemed miraculous becomes routine, and we forget to appreciate the person beside us. The health we enjoy registers in our awareness only when it falters. This adaptation serves a purpose. If we remained in a constant state of heightened appreciation for every good thing in our lives, we would never settle into the calm necessary for daily functioning. But this same adaptation creates a problem. We become numb to our blessings. We stop seeing them clearly, and then we live in a strange poverty of spirit, surrounded by genuine goods but unable to feel grateful for them. Worse still, because we have forgotten that these goods are impermanent, because we have stopped seeing them clearly, we are unprepared when loss comes. And loss always comes eventually. People die, health fails, circumstances change. Fortune, as the Stoics never tired of reminding us, is fickle. The things we depend upon can be taken from us, sometimes suddenly, sometimes without warning. When such loss arrives and we have not prepared for it, we are devastated. Not just saddened, which is natural and appropriate, but shattered. We rage at the universe for taking what we had unconsciously begun to believe was permanently ours. We feel betrayed, as if some promise had been broken, though no such promise was ever made. The Stoics observed this pattern in human life and asked a simple question. What if we could maintain our appreciation for what we have without waiting for loss to awaken it? What if we could prepare ourselves for inevitable changes without becoming anxious or bitter? What if we could hold our blessings lightly, gratefully, without either taking them for granted or clinging to them desperately? Negative visualization emerged as their answer to these questions. It is a practice of deliberately bringing to mind the possibility of loss, not to torture ourselves, but to restore our awareness of value and to prepare our minds for the changes that life inevitably brings. Notice the purpose here. The goal is not to become sad. It is not to generate fear or anxiety. It is not to convince ourselves that loss is imminent or that disaster lurks around every corner. The goal is twofold. First, to restore our appreciation for what we have by seeing it clearly again, including its impermanent nature. And second, to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally for change, so that when it comes, we are not destroyed by it. This is crucially different from worry. Worry is repetitive, unproductive mental activity focused on potential negative outcomes. It loops endlessly without resolution. It generates anxiety without producing insight or preparation. It is, in the Stoic view, a misuse of our rational faculty, an exhausting expenditure of mental energy that accomplishes nothing useful. Worry says, what if something terrible happens? What if I lose my job? What if the relationship ends? What if? And then it spins these scenarios over and over, each repetition generating more anxiety, more tension, more suffering, but no greater clarity, no actual preparation, no useful response. Negative visualization is different in almost every respect. It is intentional rather than compulsive. It is bounded rather than endless. It is clear-eyed rather than distorted by anxiety. And most importantly, it leads somewhere. It has a purpose beyond itself. When a Stoic practices negative visualization, they bring to mind a specific possibility of loss. They do this calmly, deliberately, as an exercise in awareness rather than an indulgence in fear. They might contemplate the morning when they wake to find someone they love has died in the night. They might consider the loss of their wealth, their health, their position in society. They hold this possibility in mind clearly, not because they expect it to happen immediately, but because it could happen, and because acknowledging this possibility serves a purpose. What purpose? First, the contemplation restores awareness. Suddenly, the person still living becomes precious again. The health still present becomes a gift. The ordinary morning becomes extraordinary because we see it clearly, no longer obscured by the fog of taking for granted that settles over our lives. We see what we have as what we have, not as what we will always have, and this clarity itself is a form of gratitude. Second, the contemplation prepares us. We rehearse mentally a different relationship with fortune. We practice in the safe space of imagination, accepting what the universe gives and what it takes away. This preparation is not morbid. It is realistic. The Stoics did not believe we could prevent all loss through positive thinking or careful planning. They lived in a world even more precarious than ours in many ways, where disease struck without warning, where political fortunes changed overnight, where violence was never far away. They knew that some of what we value will be taken from us. This is not pessimism. It is simply accurate observation of how human life unfolds. Given this reality, we have two choices. We can pretend that loss will never touch us, living in a fantasy of permanent possession until reality shatters that fantasy and us along with it. Or we can acknowledge the truth while we still have what we value, preparing ourselves not with anxiety but with clear sight and mental rehearsal. The Stoics chose the second path. They looked directly at impermanence. They contemplated loss before it occurred. And they found that this contemplation, far from making them miserable, actually increased their appreciation for the present and strengthened their capacity to endure inevitable change. Seneca writes of this practice with particular eloquence. He tells us that we should live each day as if it might be our last, not in a spirit of frantic urgency or hedonistic excess, but with clear appreciation for what the day contains. He suggests we say goodnight to those we love as if we might not see them again, not to frighten ourselves, but to ensure we do not leave important things unsaid. Do not let affection go unexpressed. Do not take their presence for granted. This practice, Seneca found, made him more grateful, not less, more engaged with life, not less, more able to appreciate what he had while he had it, precisely because he did not delude himself into believing he would have it forever. Similarly, Epictetus, teaching his students in his small school in Nicopolis, would remind them that when they kissed their child goodnight, they should remember that the child was mortal. This sounds harsh to modern ears, perhaps even cruel. What kind of teacher tells students to think about their children dying? But Epictetus was not trying to terrorize his students or make them anxious parents. He was trying to wake them up to the preciousness of the present moment, to the miracle of their child's current aliveness, to the gift of one more evening together. He was trying to prevent the sleepwalking that characterizes so much of human life, where we go through our days barely noticing the people and experiences we will one day desperately wish we could have back. And he was preparing them, because some of those students would lose children. In the ancient world, childhood mortality was tragically common. Epictetus himself had been enslaved and disabled. He knew suffering intimately. He knew that telling his students everything would always be fine would be a lie, and a dangerous lie at that, one that would leave them unprepared and devastated when the inevitable losses came. Better, he thought, to prepare them now. Better to help them understand that their children were never theirs to keep forever, that they were precious precisely because they were temporary, that the love they felt should be expressed fully because there are no guarantees of tomorrow. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journals during military campaigns along the frontier of the empire, repeatedly reminded himself of impermanence. He contemplated the great figures of history now gone. He reflected on the transience of fame and power. He noted that everything he saw around him had existed before in different forms and would exist again, that the patterns of life repeat endlessly, and that nothing in the realm of material existence is permanent. Were these the thoughts of a depressed man? Hardly. Marcus continued to fulfill his duties as emperor with diligence and care. He worked to administer the empire justly, to defend its borders, to serve the common good as he understood it. He maintained his relationships, his philosophical studies, his various responsibilities. These contemplations of impermanence did not paralyze him or make him withdraw from life. Instead, they seemed to give him perspective, to help him distinguish what truly mattered from what did not, to enable him to face enormous challenges without being overwhelmed. This is what negative visualization looks like in practice. It is not obsessive worry. It is not constant anxiety. It is periodic, intentional contemplation of impermanence and loss, undertaken calmly, with the specific purposes of restoring appreciation and building resilience. The practice has natural boundaries. You do not contemplate loss all day, every day. That would indeed become morbid and counterproductive. Instead, you might spend a few minutes in the morning, as part of your regular practice, bringing to mind one or two specific possibilities of loss. Or you might practice it in the moment, when you notice yourself taking something for granted, when you catch yourself in ingratitude or entitlement, when you recognize that you have stopped seeing clearly. The contemplation itself is calm and measured. You are not trying to make yourself feel terrible. You are trying to see clearly. You bring to mind the possibility of loss, you acknowledge it fully, and then you observe what shifts in your awareness. Almost always, what shifts is a restoration of appreciation. The person still present becomes precious again. The ordinary day becomes valuable. The health you still have, the roof over your head, the meal before you, all of it comes back into focus as gift rather than entitlement. And simultaneously, something else happens. You practice mentally a different relationship with these goods. You remind yourself that they are what the Stoics called preferred indifference. things that are good to have but not essential to your core well-being, things that can be lost without destroying your fundamental capacity for virtue and tranquility. You rehearse in a safe way, accepting their potential loss. This rehearsal is not the same as experiencing actual loss. Nothing can fully prepare us for grief or hardship, but mental rehearsal does help. Athletes visualize their performance before competition. Musicians imagine their concerts. Therapists use visualization techniques to help people prepare for difficult conversations or situations. The mind benefits from rehearsal, even imaginary rehearsal, because it creates neural patterns, emotional familiarity, and mental frameworks that can be drawn upon when needed. The Stoics understood this. They knew that while we cannot prevent loss, we can prepare ourselves to meet it with greater equanimity. We can practice in imagination the acceptance we will need in reality. We can build, through repeated contemplation, a mental and emotional resilience that will serve us when fortune changes. But notice what we are not doing. We are not trying to eliminate all emotional response to loss. The Stoics were not arguing for inhuman detachment or complete emotional numbness. Seneca wept at funerals. Marcus grieved the deaths of children. Epictetus acknowledged that initial emotional responses to loss are natural and not fully within our control. What is within our control is how we think about loss, how we prepare for it, and how we respond to it over time. Negative visualization helps with all of this. It helps us think more clearly about loss by acknowledging its reality before it occurs. It helps us prepare by rehearsing acceptance and practicing gratitude. And it helps us respond more skillfully when loss actually comes, because we have already contemplated this possibility, already considered how we would think about it, already reminded ourselves that the person or thing we valued was never ours to keep forever. This last point deserves emphasis. Negative visualization changes our relationship with what we value. It helps us move from a posture of entitled possession to one of grateful stewardship. We stop thinking of the people we love, the things we enjoy, the circumstances we appreciate as permanently ours by right. Instead, we begin to see them as temporary gifts, as fortunate circumstances that we are privileged to enjoy for a time, as precious precisely because they will not last forever. This shift in perspective sounds subtle, but its effects are profound. When we hold something as entitled possession, we resent any threat to it. We rage when it is taken. We cannot conceive of life without it. But when we hold something as temporary gift, we appreciate it more deeply while we have it, and we are better prepared to release it when the time comes. We can feel genuine sadness at its loss without being destroyed, genuine grief without being shattered, genuine pain without losing our fundamental stability. The philosopher who practices negative visualization develops what Marcus Aurelius called the inner citadel, a core of tranquility and strength that cannot be touched by external circumstances. This is not because they care about nothing. It is because they care deeply while simultaneously understanding that all external things are impermanent and beyond their complete control. They have learned to distinguish between what is truly theirs, their own character and choices and inner state, and what is merely on loan from fortune, everything else. In the segments ahead, we will explore this practice in much greater depth. We will examine exactly how to practice negative visualization without sliding into anxiety or worry. We will look at specific examples from the Stoic texts and from daily life. We will distinguish different types of negative visualization and their specific uses. We will address common pitfalls and misunderstandings. and we will build a complete understanding of this powerful but subtle technique. To truly understand negative visualization, we must first understand what it is not. And this distinction is more than semantic. It is the difference between a practice that frees us and one that binds us. The difference between wisdom and worry. Many people, upon first encountering the Stoic practice of negative visualization, experience a moment of resistance. The idea seems counterintuitive, perhaps even harmful. Why would we deliberately imagine losing what we love? Why would we picture difficulties before they arrive? Doesn't this simply create unnecessary anxiety? Doesn't modern psychology tell us to focus on the positive, to visualize success rather than failure? These are not foolish questions. They arise from a genuine concern for our well-being, and from a culture that often emphasizes positive thinking as the path to happiness. But they also arise from a fundamental misunderstanding of what negative visualization actually entails. Negative visualization is not worry. It is not catastrophizing. It is not the anxious spinning of worst-case scenarios in the middle of the night. It is not the rehearsal of disasters that paralyzes us with fear. These mental habits, these patterns of thought that many of us know too well, are not what the Stoics practiced or recommended. Worry is the mind's attempt to control the uncontrollable through repetitive thinking. It is the belief that if we just think about a problem enough, if we turn it over and over in our minds, we will somehow prevent it from happening or prepare ourselves adequately for it. Worry is characterized by a feeling of being trapped, of being caught in a cycle we cannot escape. Feels bad, creates tension in the body. It disturbs our sleep and occupies our waking hours with a sense of dread. The Stoic practice of negative visualization feels entirely different. It is calm, deliberate, and brief. It is an exercise in awareness rather than an exercise in fear. Where worry spirals and repeats, negative visualization concludes and releases. Where worry creates anxiety, negative visualization creates gratitude and preparedness. Consider the difference in quality. When we worry about losing our job, our mind spins scenarios of financial ruin, social embarrassment, and personal failure. We imagine conversations we might have to have, bills we might not be able to pay, judgments others might make. We feel our heart rate increase. We feel our stomach tighten. We lie awake imagining these scenarios in vivid, painful detail, and we feel worse with each repetition. The worry accomplishes nothing except to make us miserable in the present moment about something that has not happened and may never happen. When we practice negative visualization regarding our job, we do something entirely different. We take a moment, perhaps in the morning with our coffee, to acknowledge a simple truth that everything we have is temporary, including our employment. We reflect, calmly and without drama, that our job could end, not through any failure of our own necessarily, but simply because everything changes. Companies restructure, industries evolve, economies shift. This is not pessimism. It is realism. And then, having acknowledged this truth, we ask ourselves a question. If I lost this job tomorrow, would I have lived today well? Would I have treated my colleagues with respect? Would I have done work I could be proud of? Would I have learned something valuable? Would I have saved prudently and lived within my means? This line of questioning leads not to anxiety but to attention. It leads to presence. It leads to a kind of gratitude for the work we have today, and a motivation to approach it with integrity and purpose. This is the first crucial distinction. Negative visualization is not the rehearsal of fear. It is the cultivation of awareness. It is not a compulsive mental habit, but a deliberate philosophical exercise. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We engage in it consciously, and then we return to our lives with renewed appreciation and realistic preparation. The second distinction is equally important. Negative visualization is not catastrophizing. Catastrophizing is the habit of assuming the worst possible outcome and treating it as inevitable. It is the leap from a headache to a brain tumor, from a disagreement with a friend to the end of the friendship, from a mistake at work to the collapse of one's career. Catastrophizing takes a small difficulty and extrapolates it into a comprehensive disaster. Catastrophizing involves a specific kind of distortion in our thinking. It takes a possibility, often a remote possibility, and treats it as a probability or even a certainty. It involves what cognitive psychologists call probability overestimation. We vastly inflate the likelihood of negative outcomes. A person who catastrophizes looks at a 5% chance of something going wrong and experiences it as a 95% certainty. Moreover, catastrophizing involves what we might call impact inflation. Not only do we overestimate the likelihood of bad outcomes, we also overestimate how terrible those outcomes would be and how unable we would be to cope with them. We imagine ourselves utterly destroyed by events that, while difficult, are actually manageable aspects of human life. A person who catastrophizes might think something like this: I made an error in that presentation. Everyone thinks I'm incompetent. My boss is going to lose confidence in me. I'll be passed over for promotion. Eventually, they'll find a way to let me go. I'll lose my house. My family will suffer. My entire life will fall apart. All from one mistake in one presentation. This is not realistic thinking. It is not preparation. It is a kind of mental torment that serves no useful purpose. It does not make us more resilient. It makes us more fragile, more afraid, more paralyzed. Negative visualization, by contrast, is characterized by its realism and its restraint. When a Stoic practices negative visualization, she does not imagine the most extreme and unlikely disaster. She imagines what is actually possible, what actually happens to human beings in the normal course of life. She imagines loss because loss is part of life. She imagines difficulty because difficulty comes to everyone. But she does not inflate these possibilities into certainties, and she does not imagine herself incapable of bearing what comes. The Stoic practicing negative visualization might think something like this: I made an error in that presentation. That's unfortunate, and I can learn from it. But even if the consequences were more serious, even if this did damage my reputation or my career prospects, I would still have what matters most. I would still have my character, my capacity for virtue, my ability to respond with wisdom and integrity. Loss of reputation would be difficult, but it would not destroy what is truly valuable in me. And knowing this helps me now. It helps me keep perspective on the mistake, respond to it appropriately, and move forward without excessive anxiety or shame. Notice the difference in these two ways of thinking. The catastrophizer imagines the worst and feels overwhelmed. The Stoic imagines difficulty and feels capable. The catastrophizer's thinking leads to paralysis. The Stoic's thinking leads to appropriate action and inner peace. This brings us to a third crucial distinction. Negative visualization is always coupled with an affirmation of our capacity to respond virtuously to whatever occurs. It never leaves us in a state of imagined helplessness. This is what separates it from both worry and catastrophizing. When we worry or catastrophize, we imagine bad things happening to us, and we imagine ourselves as victims of these events, helpless before them, destroyed by them. The focus is entirely on the external circumstances and our powerlessness in relation to them. This is why these mental habits feel so terrible. They place us imaginatively in a position of complete vulnerability with no resources to draw upon. Negative visualization works differently because it is always grounded in the Stoic understanding of the dichotomy of control. We imagine loss or difficulty, yes, but we never imagine ourselves as helpless, because we are never helpless. We always retain what is most important, what is truly within our control. Our capacity to respond with virtue, with wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. Our character, our inner freedom. When Marcus Aurelius practiced negative visualization, he would remind himself that the people he loved would die. This sounds morbid to modern ears, perhaps even cruel. But Marcus was not wallowing in morbid thoughts. He was practicing a kind of radical honesty about the nature of existence. Everyone dies. Everyone we love will die, or we will die first and leave them. This is not pessimism. It is simply true. But Marcus never stopped there. He never ended his reflection with helplessness or despair. He coupled this awareness of mortality with a renewed commitment to love well in the time that remains. He reminded himself that since his wife, his children, his friends were mortal, since their time with him was limited and uncertain, he should appreciate them now. He should treat them with kindness now. He should not postpone affection or forgiveness or presence. He should not take them for granted as if they would be there forever. This is the heart of proper negative visualization. It moves from acknowledgement of loss to affirmation of present value to commitment to virtuous action. It has a complete arc that ends not in anxiety but in appreciation and purpose. Let us trace this arc more carefully, because understanding it is essential to practicing negative visualization correctly. The first movement is acknowledgement. We bring to conscious awareness something that is always true but that we usually keep at the periphery of our awareness. We acknowledge that what we have is temporary, that those we love are mortal, that circumstances change, that fortune is fickle, that we are vulnerable in certain ways. This acknowledgement is calm and factual. We are not working ourselves into an emotional state. We are simply stating what is true. The coffee I am drinking will eventually be finished. The morning will give way to afternoon. This day will end. This year will pass. This phase of my life will transition into another. My parents are aging. My children are growing. My body is changing. Nothing stays the same. Everything I hold is held temporarily. There is a certain kind of courage required even for this first movement. It is the courage to face reality without flinching, without the usual protective layers of denial and distraction. Our culture encourages us to avoid thinking about loss, to push away thoughts of mortality and change, to live as if what we have will last forever. Negative visualization asks us to do the opposite, to look directly at the temporary nature of all external things. But this looking is not despairing. It is clear-eyed. and this clarity is the foundation of wisdom. The second movement is appreciation. Having acknowledged that what we have is temporary, we find that our experience of it changes. What we might have taken for granted suddenly reveals its value. What we might have treated carelessly suddenly deserves our attention. What we might have postponed enjoying, thinking we had all the time in the world, suddenly becomes precious in its immediacy. This is not sentimentality. It is a natural response to awareness. When we truly understand that something will not last forever, we see it more clearly. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The everyday becomes remarkable. The simple fact that this person is here, that this moment exists, that we have this experience now becomes something worth noticing, worth savoring, worth feeling grateful for. Seneca wrote about this transformation of perception. He suggested that we should view each day as if it were both our first and our last. As our first, we approach it with freshness and curiosity, seeing everything as new. As our last, we approach it with gratitude and attention, wasting nothing, taking nothing for granted. Negative visualization helps us achieve this dual perspective. By reminding us that this day might be our last, or that this might be our last conversation with a loved one, it brings us fully into the present moment with appreciation. This appreciation is not strained or forced. It arises naturally from the acknowledgement of temporariness. We do not have to convince ourselves to be grateful. Gratitude emerges spontaneously when we stop pretending that what we have will last forever. The third movement is preparation. Having acknowledged the possibility of loss and felt renewed appreciation for what we have, we then consider calmly and practically what we would do if loss occurred. Not to rehearse anxiety, but to recognize our own resilience and capacity. This is where negative visualization becomes a tool for building genuine courage. We realize that we could bear what we fear, not that we would welcome it, not that it would not be difficult, but that we could endure it, that we have inner resources we can call upon, that we would survive and continue. This recognition of our own resilience is profoundly liberating. So much of our anxiety comes from the unconscious belief that certain losses would destroy us, that we could not survive certain difficulties. Negative visualization, properly practiced, reveals that this belief is false. We are stronger than we think. We are more adaptable than we imagine. We have survived difficulties before, and we could survive them again. But the Stoics understood that our resilience does not come from some inherent toughness or from suppressing our emotions. It comes from something much deeper. It comes from the recognition that our true good, our real well-being, does not depend on external circumstances. It depends on our character, our virtue, our inner freedom, and these cannot be taken from us by any external loss. This is the insight that transforms negative visualization from a potentially depressing exercise into a profoundly empowering one. When I imagine losing my home, my possessions, my status, even my health, I come to realize that I would still possess what matters most. I would still be capable of wisdom, courage, justice, and self-discipline. I would still be capable of kindness and integrity. I would still have my capacity to choose my responses, to find meaning, to live in accordance with virtue. External losses are real. They matter. The Stoics were not saying that losing our home or our health or our loved ones is trivial or that we should not care about these things. They are preferred indifference. things we naturally and appropriately prefer to have rather than lack. But they are not the foundation of our well-being. They are not what makes us truly happy or truly good. And knowing this difference changes everything. When we practice negative visualization with this understanding, we discover that we are simultaneously more grateful for what we have and less anxiously attached to it. We appreciate it more deeply because we see its value clearly, but we hold it more lightly because we know that our fundamental well-being does not depend on keeping it forever. This brings us to the fourth movement, which is renewed engagement with life. Negative visualization does not end with detachment or resignation. It ends with a commitment to live well now, to engage fully with what we have while we have it, to act virtuously in the present moment. Having reflected that my friend might not always be in my life, I do not withdraw from the friendship to protect myself from future pain. I engage more fully, more presently, more generously. Having reflected that my work might end, I do not stop caring about it or stop trying to do it well. I approach it with greater purpose and integrity, making sure that however long it lasts, I can be proud of how I showed up. This is the paradox of negative visualization. By contemplating loss, we become more fully present to what we have. By imagining an ending, we engage more deeply with the now. By acknowledging vulnerability, we find the courage to love and commit despite that vulnerability. Let us be very clear about the sequence and quality of this practice. Negative visualization is not a constant background hum of anxiety about loss. It is not a chronic state of bracing for disaster. It is a brief, deliberate exercise that we engage in occasionally, perhaps daily but for only a few moments, to recalibrate our perspective and renew our appreciation. The ancient Stoics might take a few minutes in the morning to reflect on the day ahead, acknowledging that various difficulties might arise and affirming their commitment to respond virtuously regardless of what happens. They might take a few moments in the evening to reflect on what they have, acknowledging its temporary nature and feeling grateful for it. This is not a heavy, anxious practice. It is light, clear, and ultimately joyful. The joy might seem paradoxical. How can contemplating loss produce joy? But those who practice negative visualization correctly report exactly this. There is a kind of joy that comes from seeing clearly, from living in truth rather than in denial. There is a joy that comes from deep appreciation. There is a joy that comes from discovering your own resilience and inner freedom. These joys are more stable and more profound than the superficial happiness that comes from pretending everything will last forever. Now we can see more clearly why negative visualization is so easily misunderstood and why the misunderstanding matters so much. If we practice it incorrectly, if we treat it as worry or catastrophizing, we create exactly the anxiety and suffering that proper practice is meant to dissolve. We make ourselves miserable in the present while gaining none of the benefits of genuine Stoic reflection. This is why precision in understanding and practice is so important. The difference between skillful negative visualization and destructive worry is not a matter of degree but of kind. They are fundamentally different mental activities with completely different qualities and outcomes. Worry is compulsive. Negative visualization is deliberate. Worry feels out of control. Negative visualization is chosen. Worry rehearses scenarios obsessively. Negative visualization reflects briefly and concludes. Worry inflates probabilities and impacts. Negative visualization maintains realism. Worry leaves us feeling helpless. Negative visualization affirms our capacity to respond virtuously. Worry creates anxiety. Negative visualization creates gratitude and preparedness. Understanding these distinctions intellectually is one thing. Maintaining them in practice is another. This is where the challenge lies. How do we ensure that our attempt at negative visualization does not slide into worry? How do we keep the practice clear and beneficial? The Stoics offer us several guidelines, several markers that help us stay on the right path. First, negative visualization is always time-limited. We give it a specific amount of time, perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps less. We engage in the reflection, we complete the arc from acknowledgement to appreciation to preparation to renewed engagement, and then we stop. We do not allow the practice to extend indefinitely. We do not ruminate. We reflect, and then we return to our lives. If we find ourselves thinking about loss or difficulty hours later, revisiting the scenarios, spinning out further possibilities, then we have left the realm of negative visualization and entered the realm of worry. The practice is meant to be contained, brief, and concluded. Second, negative visualization is always coupled with affirmation of what remains within our control. We never end the reflection feeling helpless. If we find ourselves imagining loss and feeling only despair, only vulnerability, only fear, then we are not practicing properly. We need to return to the fundamental Stoic insight. External things can be lost, but virtue cannot. Character cannot be taken from us. Our capacity to respond well to whatever happens remains intact. This is not a denial of difficulty. Loss is difficult. Suffering is real. But we are not helpless before it. We have inner resources. We have our capacity for courage, for wisdom, for finding meaning even in hardship. Remembering this is essential to proper practice. Third, negative visualization always leads to greater appreciation of the present, not to withdrawal from it. If we find ourselves becoming more detached in an unhealthy way, more reluctant to engage, more afraid to care about people or things because we might lose them, then we are missing the point entirely. The practice should make us more present, more engaged, more loving, not less. The proper response to recognizing that someone we love is mortal is not to love them less to avoid future pain. It is to love them more fully now, to be more present with them, to waste less time on trivial conflicts or on taking them for granted. The proper response to recognizing that our health is temporary is not to become obsessed with preserving it at all costs, but to use it well while we have it, to pursue meaningful activities, to serve others, to live in a way we can be proud of. Fourth, negative visualization maintains realism rather than catastrophizing to extremes. We imagine what actually happens in human life. People die, relationships end, jobs are lost, health declines, circumstances change. These are the realities we contemplate. We do not spin off into elaborate scenarios of multiple simultaneous disasters. We do not imagine ourselves incapable of coping. We stay grounded in what is actually possible and in a realistic sense of our own resilience. Seneca provides an excellent model for this realism. In his letters, he sometimes describes contemplating various losses. He imagines losing his wealth, his position, his friends, but his reflections are calm and measured. He considers what he would do, how he would respond. He recognizes that he would be sad, perhaps that such losses would be difficult. But he also recognizes that he would still have his ability to reason, to act virtuously, to find contentment in simple things. He does not inflate the disasters or deflate his capacity to cope with them. Fifth, negative visualization is motivated by wisdom and gratitude, not by fear or anxiety. We can check our motivation. Why am I engaging in this reflection? If the honest answer is that I am trying to protect myself from being blindsided, trying to control the uncontrollable through mental preparation, trying to rehearse scenarios so they will not hurt as much if they happen, then my motivation is off track. These motivations come from fear and from the illusion that we can control externals through mental effort. The proper motivation is different. We engage in negative visualization because we want to live in truth rather than in denial. Because we want to see clearly what is actually the case. Because we want to appreciate what we have while we have it. Because we want to cultivate the equanimity and perspective that comes from understanding what truly matters. These motivations come from a desire for wisdom and from a commitment to living well. When our motivation is right, the practice feels different. There is a calmness to it, a clarity. There might even be a certain peace, a release from the constant low-level anxiety of trying to keep everything under control, of trying to prevent loss through worry. Sixth, negative visualization is balanced with positive appreciation and with engagement in the actual tasks of life. It is not our only practice or our primary focus. It is one tool among many in the Stoic approach to life. We also practice gratitude directly, without the intermediate step of imagining loss. We also practice mindfulness of the present moment. We also focus on understanding what is within our control and acting virtuously in that domain. We also cultivate relationships, pursue meaningful work, contribute to our communities. Negative visualization is like adding a small amount of spice to a dish. Used correctly, it enhances the whole. But the dish is not made of spice alone. If negative visualization becomes our dominant mental habit, if we are constantly contemplating loss, then something has gone wrong. The practice should occupy only a small portion of our mental life, enhancing but not dominating our experience. Finally, the ultimate test of whether we are practicing correctly is how we feel and how we act afterward. Does the practice leave us more anxious or more peaceful? More paralyzed or more purposeful? More withdrawn or more engaged? More resentful or more grateful? The answers to these questions tell us whether we are on the right path. Proper negative visualization should leave us feeling calmer, more grounded, more appreciative, more present. It should lead to action rather than paralysis. We should find ourselves treating loved ones with more kindness, approaching our work with more purpose, appreciating simple pleasures more fully, wasting less time on trivial matters. If these are the fruits of our practice, we can trust that we are doing it well. If, on the other hand, we find ourselves more anxious, more fearful, more reluctant to engage with life, more cynical or resigned, then we need to stop and reconsider. We may be worrying rather than practicing negative visualization. We may be catastrophizing rather than reflecting realistically. We may need to return to the fundamentals of Stoic philosophy, to the understanding of the dichotomy of control and the nature of virtue, before attempting this more advanced practice. It is worth noting that not everyone is ready for negative visualization, and that is perfectly fine. Some people are naturally prone to anxiety or to catastrophizing. Some people are in a vulnerable mental state due to grief, depression, or trauma. For these individuals, negative visualization might not be helpful or appropriate, at least not without guidance from a therapist or experienced teacher. There is no shame in recognizing this. Stoicism offers many practices, and we each must find the ones that serve us best in our current circumstances. For those who are ready, however, who can maintain the necessary distinctions and discipline, negative visualization is a profound tool. It is a way of training ourselves to see reality clearly, to appreciate deeply, to build genuine resilience, and to live with both engagement and equanimity. It is a way of loosening the grip of anxious attachment without falling into cold detachment. It is a way of loving fully while acknowledging impermanence. The practice becomes easier and more natural with time. At first, it requires conscious effort to maintain the right attitude, to avoid sliding into worry, to complete the arc properly. We must remind ourselves of the distinctions we have explored. We must be vigilant about our motivation and honest about the quality of our experience. But as with any practice, repetition builds skill. We become more familiar with the texture of proper negative visualization. We learn to recognize immediately when we have strayed into worry or catastrophizing, and we learn to gently redirect ourselves. The practice becomes smoother, more efficient, more reliably beneficial. Over time, negative visualization begins to shape our fundamental orientation to life. We do not need to consciously practice it as often because its insights have become integrated into our everyday awareness. We naturally see things more clearly. We naturally appreciate more deeply. We naturally hold our possessions and relationships with that balance of warm engagement and light attachment that is the mark of Stoic wisdom. We find that we are less often blindsided by loss, not because we have become cynical or emotionally defended, but because we have developed a realistic understanding of how life works. We know that change is constant, that nothing external lasts forever, that difficulties arise. When loss comes, we are sad, we grieve appropriately, but we are not shattered. We have the inner resources to cope. We remember what remains within our control. We also find that we are more grateful more often for what we have. We do not take our health for granted until we lose it. We do not take our loved ones for granted until they are gone. We see the gift of their presence now. We see the gift of this ordinary day, this simple meal, this moment of peace. Everything becomes more vivid, more valuable because we understand its impermanence. This is the great paradox and the great gift of negative visualization properly practiced. By facing impermanence directly, we become more fully alive to the present. By acknowledging loss, we discover gratitude. By recognizing our vulnerability to external changes, we discover our inner strength. By contemplating death, we learn how to live. The ancient Stoics understood this deeply. They did not practice negative visualization because they were pessimists who enjoyed dwelling on loss. They practiced it because they were realists who wanted to live fully, to appreciate deeply, to build genuine resilience, and to maintain inner freedom regardless of external circumstances. They practiced it because it worked, because it delivered what it promised. A clearer vision of reality, a more grateful engagement with life, a well-founded sense of courage and capability. We can trust their experience and their wisdom. Negative visualization, when understood correctly and practiced skillfully, is not a source of anxiety but a cure for it. Not a withdrawal from life but a fuller embrace of it. Not a morbid dwelling on loss but a joyful appreciation of what is present. The practice asks us to look at difficult truths, but it gives us something precious in return. The capacity to live without denial, without false hope, without anxious attachment, yet also without cynicism, without resignation, without cold detachment. The capacity to love and engage and appreciate fully, while also maintaining the equanimity and freedom that comes from understanding what truly matters. This is negative visualization done right. Not as a burden but as a gift. Not as a source of suffering but as a path to wisdom and peace. As we continue to explore this practice in its specific applications and nuances, we carry with us this fundamental understanding. We know what it is and what it is not. We know how to recognize when we are practicing correctly and how to redirect when we stray. We know the arc it should trace and the fruits it should bear. With this foundation firmly established, we can now explore the practice more deeply, examining how it applies to different areas of life and how it interacts with the other core teachings of Stoicism. Having explored the fundamental structure of negative visualization and its distinction from anxiety, we must now turn to a more nuanced question. How does this practice actually work within the mind? What mechanisms does it engage? Understanding this helps us see why the practice can go wrong and why it requires such careful attention. Consider that the human mind is constantly engaged in simulation. We imagine future conversations, rehearse plans, anticipate outcomes. This capacity for mental simulation is one of our most powerful cognitive abilities. It allows us to prepare, to learn from imagined scenarios without having to experience them directly, to navigate complex social situations. Negative visualization is a deliberate harnessing of this natural capacity, but it directs this simulation in a specific way with a specific purpose. It asks us to imagine not what we hope will happen, but what we hope will not happen. This reversal requires explanation because on its surface it seems counterintuitive. Why would deliberately imagining loss or difficulty be beneficial? The answer lies in how the practice affects our perception of the present moment. When we engage in proper negative visualization, we temporarily adopt a perspective from which we have already lost something we currently possess. We imagine ourselves looking back at this present moment from a future in which we no longer have what we now have. This imaginative shift creates a kind of perceptual distance. From this imagined vantage point, the present appears different. What we take for granted becomes visible again. What has faded into the background through familiarity comes forward into awareness. The practice creates a contrast that makes the present more vivid, more clearly seen. Think of how we perceive light. We see light most clearly in contrast with darkness. A candle in bright sunlight barely registers. The same candle in darkness commands our attention. Negative visualization works with a similar principle of contrast. By temporarily imagining absence, we make presence more perceptible. But this explains only part of the mechanism. The practice also engages our emotional responses in a specific way. When we imagine loss, we naturally feel some emotional response to that imagined scenario. This response, when the practice is done properly, is mild, contained, and ultimately relieved by the recognition that the loss is only imagined. This cycle, imagining loss, feeling the emotional response, recognizing the actual present, creates a kind of emotional recalibration. We feel gratitude not as an abstract concept, but as a lived emotional reality. The contrast makes the feeling immediate and genuine. Seneca described this as making ourselves richer, by recognizing what we already possess. He wasn't speaking of material wealth, though his language drew on economic metaphors. He meant that our actual experience of our lives becomes richer, more full, when we perceive clearly what is actually present rather than taking it for granted. This richness of experience is quite different from the accumulation of more things or circumstances. It's an intensification of our awareness of what already is. This distinction is crucial because it reveals why negative visualization produces gratitude rather than craving. It doesn't make us want more. It makes us perceive more fully what we have. The practice also works on our assumptions about permanence. Most of us, most of the time, operate with an implicit assumption that our current circumstances will continue. We know intellectually that everything changes, that loss is inevitable, that our lives and the lives of those we love are temporary. But this knowledge remains abstract, theoretical, disconnected from our daily experience. This disconnection serves a psychological function. If we remained constantly, vividly aware of impermanence, we might find it difficult to function, to plan, to invest emotional energy in relationships and projects. So we bracket this awareness, we hold it at a distance, we let ourselves live as though the temporary were permanent. The cost of this bracketing, however, is a kind of perceptual numbness. We stop seeing clearly what is actually before us. Our relationships become routines. Our health becomes background assumption. Our very lives become something we imagine we'll attend to later, when we have time, when circumstances change, when we finally arrive at some imagined future moment. Negative visualization gently, temporarily, dissolves this bracketing. It brings into consciousness what we have been holding at a distance, but it does so in a controlled way, through imagination rather than actual loss, and with the immediate relief of recognizing that what we imagined losing is still present. This controlled exposure to impermanence serves a dual purpose. First, it makes the present more vivid, as we've discussed. But second, it gradually reduces the shock of actual loss when it inevitably occurs. Not because we become callous or indifferent, but because we have already begun the process of acknowledging reality. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about the need to see things as they actually are, without the additions of judgment and fantasy. He described this as a kind of philosophical exercise, a training of perception. Negative visualization is one such exercise. It trains us to see the temporary nature of what we have without requiring us to pretend that this doesn't matter. The practice acknowledges that impermanence matters, that loss will hurt, that we are not indifferent to what happens to us and those we love. But it suggests that clear seeing, even of difficult truths, is ultimately less painful than the shock of being unprepared, of having believed our own comforting illusions so completely that reality becomes traumatic. There's a compassion in this practice, though it might not initially appear so. It's the compassion of helping ourselves prepare, of refusing to leave our future selves completely unready for what will inevitably come. It's the recognition that we owe ourselves this preparation, this gentle training in reality. But the practice can fail in its mechanism if we misunderstand what we're training. We're not training ourselves to stop caring, to become emotionally numb, to protect ourselves through detachment. We're training ourselves to see clearly while continuing to care, to hold both love and awareness of loss, to value what we have precisely because we understand it won't last forever. This is a delicate balance, and it's why the practice requires such care. If we tip too far toward emotional protection, we've missed the point entirely. let us examine more closely what happens when negative visualization goes wrong. Understanding the failure modes of the practice helps us recognize them in our own experience and adjust accordingly. These failure modes are not mere theoretical possibilities. They represent common ways the practice can become distorted. The first and most obvious failure mode is when negative visualization becomes indistinguishable from anxiety. The person sits down to practice, begins to imagine loss or difficulty, and finds themselves spiraling into genuine worry. The heart rate increases, the breath becomes shallow, the mind begins racing through catastrophic scenarios with increasing emotional intensity. What has happened here? The practice has been stripped of its container. Proper negative visualization occurs within a framework of recognition that this is an imaginative exercise, done deliberately with a specific purpose. It has clear boundaries. We enter it consciously, and we exit it consciously, returning to awareness of what actually is. When this framework collapses, imagination loses its quality of as if and begins to feel like prediction. We're no longer temporarily adopting an imagined perspective. We're convincing ourselves that loss is imminent. The practice has transformed into its opposite. This failure often occurs when someone brings existing anxiety to the practice. If I'm already worried about something, negative visualization regarding that specific concern will likely amplify the worry rather than create reflective distance. This is why the Stoics emphasized that the practice should be done from a place of relative calm, not as a response to acute fear. The second failure mode is when the practice becomes a kind of magical thinking, an attempt to prevent loss through imagination. There's a superstitious quality to this distortion. If I imagine the worst, perhaps it won't happen. If I'm prepared for everything, nothing bad can surprise me. This failure reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of control. Negative visualization is meant to acknowledge what we cannot control, to help us see clearly the limits of our power. But when it becomes magical thinking, it's actually an attempt to extend control through mental activity. We imagine we can somehow influence outcomes by imagining them in advance. This distortion often manifests as obsessive, repetitive imagination of loss. The person returns again and again to the same scenarios, not finding peace or gratitude, but becoming more entangled in the imagining itself. The practice has become compulsive rather than contemplative. A third failure mode occurs when negative visualization is used to justify present neglect. If everything is temporary and will be lost anyway, why invest care in maintaining it? Why attend to relationships when they'll end? Why take care of health when death is inevitable? This is a collapse into nihilism masquerading as Stoic practice. The Stoics would have recognized this immediately as a profound misunderstanding. The impermanence of something doesn't negate its value. In many ways, it intensifies that value. A sunset matters partly because it will end. A conversation matters partly because this exact moment will not come again. Proper negative visualization should deepen our engagement with the present, not justify withdrawal from it. A fourth failure mode is more subtle but equally important. This occurs when negative visualization becomes theatrical, a kind of performance of Stoic practice without genuine engagement. The person dutifully imagines loss, goes through the mental motions, but remains emotionally disconnected from the exercise. It's as though they're following a recipe without tasting what they're cooking. This performance often stems from treating Stoicism as a set of techniques to apply rather than a philosophy to embody. The person has learned that Stoics practice negative visualization, so they practice negative visualization, but without understanding why or engaging with the deeper questions the practice raises. The result is that nothing changes. There's no increase in gratitude, no shift in perception, no building of resilience. The practice becomes empty ritual, done because it's supposed to be done, but disconnected from actual experience. This failure mode is particularly common in our contemporary context, where philosophical practices are often extracted from their larger frameworks and presented as isolated techniques. Without understanding the whole structure of Stoic thought, negative visualization can seem like a strange mental exercise rather than a practice that makes sense within a coherent worldview. A fifth failure mode emerges when someone uses negative visualization to suppress joy or positive emotion. This person reasons, if I become too happy, the eventual loss will hurt more, so I'll use negative visualization to dampen my positive feelings, to maintain emotional equilibrium by never feeling too much of anything. This represents a profound distortion of the practice. The Stoics were not advocating for emotional suppression or the elimination of joy. Seneca delighted in his friendships. Marcus Aurelius expressed deep love for his philosophy teachers. Epictetus clearly took joy in teaching. The point was never to feel nothing, but to feel appropriately, based on clear perception. Negative visualization should actually enhance our capacity for joy by making us more aware of what we have. When we recognize the temporary nature of good things, we appreciate them more fully in their presence. The practice should make joy more intense, not less, because it's joy with awareness, joy that fully acknowledges the preciousness of what is present. Each of these failure modes shares a common characteristic. They represent some kind of avoidance. We're avoiding genuine feeling, or avoiding uncertainty, or avoiding full engagement with life. We're using a practice meant to bring us closer to reality as a way to distance ourselves from it. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about negative visualization. It's meant to increase contact with reality, not decrease it. When the practice goes wrong, it's almost always because we've unconsciously turned it into a strategy for avoiding something we find difficult to face. Recognizing these failure modes in ourselves requires honesty and careful attention. Often, we won't notice immediately that the practice has become distorted. The distortion happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. This is why regular reflection on our practice is essential, why we must keep returning to the question, what is this actually doing? How am I actually experiencing this? With these failure modes clearly understood, we can examine what successful practice actually looks like. This requires moving beyond general descriptions to something more concrete, more tangible. What is the actual experience of negative visualization done well? First, there's a quality of deliberateness of conscious choice. The practitioner decides to engage with this exercise. There's no sense of being overwhelmed by thoughts or dragged into worry. Instead, there's an intentional turning of attention toward a specific contemplation. This deliberateness means the practice has a beginning. You might pause in your day, find a moment of quiet, and think, I'm going to spend a few minutes reflecting on what I have and its temporary nature. This conscious beginning creates a container for what follows. Within this container, the imagination engages gently. You might consider your health, and allow yourself to imagine what it would be like to lose some physical capacity you currently possess. But this imagining remains light, exploratory. There's no forcing, no dramatic visualization, no attempt to make yourself feel intense emotion. The emotional response that arises is mild, appropriate to the fact that you're engaging with imagination rather than reality. You might feel a slight tightening in the chest, a moment of sadness, a touch of fear, but these feelings remain contained, manageable. They don't overwhelm or spiral. Then comes the crucial turn, the recognition of what actually is. You open your eyes, perhaps, or simply shift your mental frame and acknowledge, but I do have my health right now. In this moment, my body is functioning. I can move, sense, engage with the world. This recognition isn't forced gratitude or manufactured positivity. It's simply clear seeing of what is actually present. The emotional response to this recognition is also natural, unforced. There might be relief or quiet appreciation or a softening in the body. Again, nothing dramatic or overwhelming, but something genuine. The gratitude that arises feels earned through the contemplation, not imposed from outside. After this, there's a natural completion. The exercise ends and you return to your daily activities. But something has shifted, however subtly. You might notice you move through the next hours with slightly more awareness, slightly more appreciation. The taken for granted has become temporarily visible again. This entire cycle might take only 5 or 10 minutes. The practice doesn't require long periods of time. What matters is the quality of attention brought to it, not the duration. Brief and genuine is far more valuable than extended and mechanical. The frequency of practice varies by individual. Some people find daily negative visualization helpful. Others practice weekly or even less frequently. The Stoics didn't prescribe rigid schedules. What matters is that the practice remains fresh, that it doesn't become rote repetition. Over time, with consistent practice, certain effects become noticeable. The first is an increased capacity to find genuine appreciation for ordinary circumstances. Things that once seemed barely worth noticing, the default conditions of your life, begin to appear more clearly as gifts that could be lost. This isn't a matter of convincing yourself to be grateful. It's a natural result of repeatedly practicing perceptual contrast. Your baseline of awareness shifts. You see more clearly, more often, without effort. The second effect is a quiet kind of readiness. Not anxiety about future loss, but a settled acknowledgement that loss will come, that change is constant, that nothing in our external circumstances is guaranteed. This readiness doesn't feel heavy or burdensome. It's more like the readiness of someone who has checked that they have an umbrella before leaving the house on a cloudy day. Practical, calm, appropriate. This readiness means that when actual loss occurs, as it inevitably will, we're not completely blindsided. The shock is still there, the grief is still real, but there's also some part of us that recognizes, yes, I knew this was possible. I knew nothing lasts forever. This small recognition doesn't eliminate pain, but it prevents the additional suffering that comes from feeling that reality has betrayed us. A third effect is more subtle but perhaps most important. Regular negative visualization gradually dissolves the unconscious assumption that we're entitled to what we have. This assumption operates below conscious awareness for most people. We don't actively think we're entitled to our health, our relationships, our abilities. But we live as though these things are guaranteed, as though they're owed to us simply by virtue of our existence. When this assumption dissolves, something interesting happens. We stop relating to life as though it owes us anything. We stop feeling cheated when things don't go as we hoped. We stop maintaining an unconscious ledger of what we deserve versus what we receive. This shift brings tremendous freedom because we're no longer in constant, invisible conflict with reality. This doesn't mean we become passive or stop working to improve our circumstances. The Stoics were often highly engaged in public life, working to make things better. But they did so without the underlying resentment that comes from feeling life is somehow unfair when it doesn't provide what we want. Marcus Aurelius, with all his power as emperor, maintained this perspective. He didn't feel entitled to his position, to his health, to the obedience of his subjects. He approached each day as an opportunity to fulfill his role well, but without the assumption that any of it was guaranteed or owed to him. Negative visualization helped maintain this perspective. By regularly acknowledging that he could lose everything, health, position, life itself at any moment, he freed himself from the tyranny of entitlement. He could engage fully with his responsibilities while holding them lightly, knowing they were temporary roles rather than permanent possessions. For us, this same freedom is available. When we regularly practice negative visualization, we gradually release ourselves from the exhausting work of maintaining grievances against reality. We stop telling ourselves stories about how things should be different, how we shouldn't have to deal with difficulties, how it's not fair that we face limitations. This release doesn't make us callous or indifferent. We still prefer health to illness, comfort to pain, presence to absence. These are what the Stoics called preferred indifference, things that are naturally preferable but not essential to our inner freedom and virtue. We work toward them when we can, but we don't base our peace of mind on whether we obtain them. The practice of negative visualization also reveals something about the nature of attachment. We often hear that we should not be attached to external things, that attachment causes suffering. But this teaching is easily misunderstood. It seems to suggest we should not love people, should not value what we have, should remain somehow aloof from our own lives. The Stoics offered a more nuanced understanding. The issue is not connection or love or valuing what we have. The issue is when we bind our inner peace, our fundamental well-being, to things outside our control. When we make our tranquility conditional on circumstances remaining as we want them to be, we've given away our freedom. Negative visualization helps us maintain connection while releasing this binding. We can deeply love someone while acknowledging they won't live forever. We can value our abilities while knowing they may diminish. We can enjoy comfort while recognizing it's temporary. The practice helps us hold things with what we might call an open hand. Present, caring, engaged, but not desperately grasping. This open-handed holding is not the same as indifference. When Epictetus spoke of his lame leg, he wasn't indifferent to his disability. When Seneca faced exile, he wasn't indifferent to the loss of his home and position. When Marcus Aurelius lost children to illness, he wasn't indifferent to their deaths. But in each case, they maintained some core of themselves that wasn't shattered by external circumstances. Negative visualization cultivates this core. By repeatedly acknowledging that we could lose what we have, by practicing the mental movement from having to not having and back again, we strengthen our capacity to remain ourselves regardless of circumstances. This is what the Stoics meant by the inner citadel, not a place of retreat from life, but a stable center that remains regardless of external changes. Negative visualization is one of the practices that helps build and maintain this center. The practice also connects to the larger Stoic understanding of providence and the nature of reality. The Stoics believed that we live in a fundamentally rational universe, that everything that happens is part of a larger coherent whole, even when we can't see that coherence. They called this logos, the rational principle governing all things. For the Stoics, accepting loss wasn't resignation to meaningless suffering. It was alignment with the nature of a universe in which change is constant, in which creation and destruction are ongoing processes, in which our individual lives are brief moments in an incomprehensibly vast whole. Negative visualization, from this perspective, is practice in accepting our place in this larger pattern. We acknowledge that our individual preferences, while valid and natural, don't determine how reality unfolds. We practice seeing ourselves as parts of something larger, subject to the same processes of change that govern everything. This might sound abstract, but it has concrete implications. When we understand ourselves as parts of a larger whole, temporary expressions of processes that have been unfolding for billions of years, our individual losses take on a different character. They're still painful, still matter, but they're also somehow natural, appropriate, part of how things are. This understanding doesn't eliminate grief, but it does eliminate the existential shock of feeling that something deeply wrong has occurred when we experience loss. We're sad, we grieve, we feel the pain of absence, but we're not in metaphysical rebellion against reality itself. We have walked through the conceptual landscape of negative visualization, tracing its philosophical foundations and distinguishing it from the anxiety-driven patterns that masquerade as Stoic practice. We have examined the testimony of Seneca, the reflections of Epictetus, and the private notebooks of Marcus Aurelius. We have seen how this technique, properly understood, serves not to generate fear but to clarify perception, not to burden the mind but to liberate it from the tyranny of false security. Now we turn toward application. Theory without practice remains incomplete, a map never used for navigation. The Stoics were intensely practical philosophers. They did not construct elaborate systems for intellectual admiration alone. They developed techniques to be used, principles to be lived, exercises to transform the quality of daily experience. Negative visualization belongs to this practical tradition. It is a tool, and like any tool, its value emerges through skilled use. Yet application presents its own challenges. The gap between understanding a principle and integrating it into life can be vast. We may comprehend the distinction between contemplation and catastrophizing, yet find ourselves slipping into worry when we attempt the practice. We may appreciate the logic of considering loss without actually knowing how to begin such contemplation in a constructive way. We may recognize the value of preparation without knowing what, specifically, we should prepare for, or how to structure such preparation so it serves wisdom rather than feeds anxiety. This segment addresses these practical questions directly. How do we actually practice negative visualization in daily life? Where do we begin? How often should we engage in this contemplation? How do we structure the practice so it remains aligned with Stoic principles rather than drifting toward morbid preoccupation? What specific exercises serve the goals of appreciation and resilience without generating unnecessary suffering? These questions matter because technique matters. The same principle applied clumsily can harm rather than help. Applied skillfully, it can transform our relationship with everything we value. The difference lies not in the principle itself, but in the manner of its application. Consider first the question of frequency and duration. Some approaches to negative visualization suggest making it a daily practice, perhaps each morning or evening. Others recommend occasional contemplation, perhaps weekly or when facing specific decisions. The Stoics themselves varied in their approaches. Seneca describes both regular evening reflection and specific contemplations before journeys or significant events. Marcus Aurelius's notebooks suggest frequent but brief moments of reflection, woven into the texture of daily thought rather than set apart as formal exercises. The question of frequency cannot be answered abstractly. It depends on individual temperament, current circumstances, and specific goals. Someone prone to anxiety may benefit from brief, infrequent sessions with clear boundaries, preventing the practice from feeding worry patterns. Someone who tends toward complacency or entitlement may benefit from more regular contemplation, using it as a consistent reminder of fortune's provisional nature. Someone facing a specific decision or transition may engage more intensely with scenarios relevant to that situation. What matters more than frequency is quality of attention. A single moment of genuine contemplation can shift perspective more profoundly than weeks of mechanical repetition. The goal is not to log hours of negative visualization, but to cultivate a certain relationship with fortune, a certain clarity about what we possess and how we hold it. This brings us to the structure of the practice itself. How do we actually engage in negative visualization? What does a session look like? Let us explore this through concrete description rather than abstract instruction. You might begin by sitting quietly, not in a meditative posture necessarily, but simply in a state of calm attention. The goal is not to achieve a particular state of consciousness, but to think clearly. You are not emptying the mind, but directing it towards specific considerations. You might start with something modest, something present in your immediate life that you value. Perhaps a relationship, a capability, a possession that serves you well, a circumstance that provides comfort or opportunity. The Stoics often began with what was closest at hand. Epictetus would ask his students to consider the clay oil lamp they used each evening. Seneca contemplated his library, his health, his friendships. Marcus Aurelius reflected on his position, his duties, his teachers. Having brought this valued element to mind, you then engage in a very specific contemplation. You consider its absence, not its loss through catastrophe, but simply its absence. What would experience be like without this element? Not as a prediction of future suffering, but as an exploration of conditional reality. You are not imagining yourself distraught, but rather examining the structure of your present fortune. This is where precision matters enormously. You are not visualizing tragedy. You are not imagining yourself receiving terrible news. You are not constructing narratives of loss. These dramatizations pull contemplation toward catastrophizing. Instead, you are simply considering the logical possibility of absence and what that absence would mean. For example, if contemplating a relationship, you are not imagining the funeral, the grief, the empty rooms. You are considering what your life contained before this relationship existed, and what it would contain if it existed no more. The difference is subtle but crucial. One approach feeds emotion and narrative. The other clarifies structure and fortune. As you consider this absence, you notice what the presence of this element provides. You see its contribution more clearly, not through comparison with imagined suffering, but through awareness of its specificity. Every valued element of life provides something particular, something that distinguishes its presence from its absence. Negative visualization, practiced well, brings this particularity into focus. You might notice, for instance, that a certain relationship provides not just companionship in general, but a specific kind of understanding, a particular quality of humor, a unique perspective that challenges your assumptions in productive ways. Without imagining the person's death, you can recognize that these qualities emerge from the specific person, that they are not guaranteed features of existence but fortunate particulars. Or you might contemplate a capability, perhaps your health or a skill you have developed. What does this capability make possible? What would be foreclosed without it? Again, you are not imagining disease or injury. You are simply recognizing that this capability is not inherent to existence but a provisional gift, subject to change through countless factors beyond your complete control. This contemplation naturally gives rise to appreciation, not gratitude directed toward a cosmic gift giver, but simple recognition of fortune. You have this element in your life not because you absolutely deserve it or because existence owes it to you, but because circumstances have aligned to make it present. This recognition does not diminish joy, it clarifies it. You can enjoy what you have more fully when you recognize it as fortune rather than entitlement. The contemplation also prepares. By considering absence calmly, before any actual loss occurs, you rehearse a kind of acceptance. You remind yourself that you hold this valued element conditionally, that its loss would require adaptation but not destruction of your capacity for well-being. This rehearsal does not prevent grief should loss occur, but it prevents the particular suffering that comes from feeling reality has betrayed fundamental expectations. Having explored a basic structure, we can consider variations that serve different purposes. Negative visualization is not a single exercise but a flexible technique adaptable to various situations and goals. One variation focuses specifically on daily routine. Each evening before sleep, you might briefly consider the day's ordinary goods. Not the exceptional moments, but the unremarkable functioning that made the day possible. Did you wake without pain? Were you able to move through your environment without significant obstacle? Did you have enough to eat? Were you safe from immediate threat? These basic conditions, so easily overlooked, constitute extraordinary fortune when viewed against the vast range of possible human experience. Contemplating their absence requires no morbid imagination. You simply recognize that each of these ordinary goods depends on countless factors, most beyond your control. Your continued health depends on the proper functioning of systems you do not consciously direct. Your safety depends on social structures you did not create. Your access to food depends on supply chains you cannot guarantee. Recognizing this dependence does not make you feel anxious. It makes you feel fortunate. The day that seemed ordinary reveals itself as remarkably smooth, blessedly uneventful. This daily practice serves as an antidote to hedonic adaptation, that tendency to take for granted whatever becomes familiar. We adjust quickly to good fortune, then fail to notice it except through its absence. Regular, brief contemplation of possible absence keeps ordinary goods visible, prevents their fading into the unnoticed background of expectation. Another variation focuses on upcoming events or situations. Seneca described this practice extensively. Before embarking on a journey, he would contemplate possible difficulties, delays, bad weather, uncomfortable conditions, hostile officials, thieves, shipwreck. But notice how he frames this contemplation. He is not predicting these difficulties or imagining himself devastated by them. He is simply acknowledging that any journey involves uncertainty, that comfort cannot be guaranteed, that he may need to adapt to circumstances beyond his preference. This contemplation serves preparation without generating anxiety. By acknowledging possible difficulties beforehand, Seneca ensures that their occurrence will not surprise or disturb him. If the journey proceeds smoothly, he experiences it as fortunate. If difficulties arise, he recognizes them as possibilities he had already considered, events that fall within the range of expected experience rather than violations of assumed order. We can apply this same approach to any upcoming situation that involves uncertainty. Before an important conversation, we might contemplate that it may not produce our preferred outcome. Before a project deadline, we might consider that complications may arise. Before a celebration, we might acknowledge that not everything may unfold as planned. In each case, we are not predicting failure or imagining catastrophe. We are simply recognizing the uncertain nature of future events, the conditional quality of our influence over outcomes. This recognition paradoxically increases effectiveness. When we acknowledge that we cannot guarantee outcomes, we focus more clearly on what we can control: our preparation, our attention, our response to whatever unfolds. We act more skillfully because we are not burdened by the impossible project of forcing reality to conform to our detailed expectations. A third variation addresses specific attachments that may have become disproportionate or unhealthy. Sometimes we hold something with such tight desperation that we make ourselves miserable, constantly anxious about its potential loss, unable to enjoy its presence because we are so fearful of its absence. This desperate clinging harms both ourselves and often the very thing we clutch. For these disproportionate attachments, negative visualization serves a liberating function. By contemplating loss deliberately and calmly, we confront what we are already fearing constantly. But we confront it with reason rather than panic. We ask ourselves clearly, what would life actually be like without this element? Would it be difficult? Perhaps. Would it require adjustment? Certainly. Would it mean the end of all possibility for well-being? Almost never. This honest examination often reveals that our fear has exaggerated the stakes. We discover that we could, in fact, adapt to the loss. Life would continue. Other sources of meaning and satisfaction would remain or emerge. This discovery does not make us care less about what we value. It makes us hold it more gracefully, with open hands rather than clenched fists. The paradox is that this looser grip often allows us to enjoy presence more fully. When we are not constantly terrified of loss, we can actually attend to what is here now. The relationship we were desperately clinging to can breathe, can develop naturally, can be experienced for what it actually offers rather than what we demand it provide to justify our survival. The capability we were anxiously protecting can be used freely rather than hoarded fearfully. This variation of the practice requires particular care. When working with strong attachments, the line between constructive contemplation and feeding anxiety becomes especially thin. If the contemplation increases rather than decreases anxious clinging, it is being practiced incorrectly. The goal is not to rehearse fear but to examine it rationally, to discover that what we fear, while genuinely unwelcome, is not actually catastrophic to our fundamental capacity for living well. You might also practice negative visualization in moments of frustration or disappointment. When minor inconveniences disturb your peace, when small obstacles trigger disproportionate irritation, you can use negative visualization as perspective correction. The delayed train seems unbearable until you contemplate having no access to transport at all. The uncomfortable room temperature seems intolerable until you consider being exposed to actual extremes without shelter. The mediocre meal seems disappointing until you remember that much of humanity struggles to obtain adequate calories. This application is not about inducing guilt or forcing false gratitude. It is about accurate assessment. The minor inconvenience is indeed minor, and recognizing its minor nature through comparison with genuine hardship returns your emotional response to appropriate proportion. You need not feel grateful for the delayed train, but you need not let it ruin your peace either. Some practitioners extend negative visualization beyond personal circumstances to contemplate larger fragilities. They consider the vast infrastructure that makes modern life possible: power grids, water systems, supply networks, medical knowledge, political stability, technological functioning. They recognize how much of what seems permanent and guaranteed is actually provisional, dependent on continued functioning of complex systems maintained by human effort and favorable conditions. This broader contemplation serves two purposes. First, it generates appreciation for civilizational achievements we typically ignore. The water that flows from taps, the electricity that powers lights, the roads that allow movement. These represent extraordinary human accomplishment, the fruit of centuries of accumulated knowledge and ongoing maintenance. Recognizing their contingency makes their presence remarkable rather than invisible. Second, it cultivates philosophical resilience regarding large-scale disruption. The Stoics lived through civil wars, natural disasters, political chaos, and social collapse. They knew firsthand that civilizational stability cannot be assumed. By acknowledging this truth calmly, before crisis, they prepared themselves to maintain inner stability regardless of outer circumstances. We need not expect civilizational collapse to benefit from this preparation. Simply recognizing that the systems we depend on require continued favorable conditions helps us hold them appropriately, without the entitled assumption that they will function forever simply because they function today. This recognition may also motivate us to contribute to their maintenance, to support rather than merely consume the infrastructure that serves us. In all these variations, certain principles remain constant. The contemplation stays cognitive rather than emotional. You think about absence. You do not work yourself into distress about it. You acknowledge possibility. You do not predict probability. You recognize fortune. You do not generate suffering. You prepare for adaptation. You do not rehearse devastation. The practice also requires honesty about individual differences. What serves one person may harm another. Someone with strong philosophical temperament may engage in extensive contemplation without difficulty, even finding it energizing and clarifying. Someone with different psychological tendencies may need to keep sessions brief and bounded, using the practice sparingly and carefully. Neither approach is superior. Both represent appropriate adaptation to individual nature. The Stoics themselves acknowledged this variability. Epictetus, with his uncompromising intensity, practiced negative visualization constantly and comprehensively. Seneca, more psychologically nuanced, recommended moderation and awareness of personal limits. Marcus Aurelius, balancing philosophical commitment with practical responsibility, seemed to practice in moments of reflection rather than extended sessions. What matters is that the practice serves its intended purposes: appreciation, preparation, and resilience. If your practice increases anxiety rather than settling it, you are either catastrophizing rather than contemplating, or the technique may not suit your temperament at this time. The Stoics offered many practices. Negative visualization is powerful but not mandatory for everyone. You might also combine negative visualization with other Stoic exercises. After contemplating potential absence, you might shift to practicing voluntary discomfort, actually experiencing mild deprivation to confirm your capability to handle less than ideal conditions. Or you might move into evening review, examining how you responded to the day's actual events and where you might practice greater virtue tomorrow. These practices reinforce each other. Negative visualization prepares you for difficulty. Voluntary discomfort proves you can handle difficulty. Evening review reveals where difficulty triggered unskillful response and where you might improve. Together, they form a comprehensive training in Stoic resilience, each element strengthening the others. As you develop facility with the practice, you may find it becoming less formal, more integrated into ongoing awareness. Rather than setting aside specific times for contemplation, you may notice moments throughout the day when appreciation arises spontaneously from awareness of fortune. You catch yourself enjoying a moment and simultaneously recognizing its provisional nature, which deepens rather than diminishes the enjoyment. This integration represents mature practice. Negative visualization is ultimately not about formal sessions but about developing a way of seeing, a recognition that all present goods are fortunate, that nothing is guaranteed, that everything we have comes to us through circumstance as much as through our efforts. This recognition, once established, colors all experience. It makes ordinary moments precious without making you fearful of their passing. The practice also develops capacity for what the Stoics called the view from above, the ability to zoom out and see your life, your concerns, your attachments in broader context. When you regularly contemplate loss and adaptation, you naturally develop perspective on what matters most, what serves genuine well-being versus what serves only ego or habit. This perspective shift allows you to direct your energy more wisely. You may find yourself caring less about status markers that once seemed crucial and more about character development that actually determines the quality of your inner life. You may find yourself less defensive about minor slights and more attentive to opportunities for virtue. You may find yourself less attached to specific outcomes and more committed to acting skillfully regardless of results. These shifts emerge naturally from the practice rather than being forced through willpower. When you consistently recognize the conditional nature of externals, you naturally invest less identity in their specific configurations. When you regularly contemplate loss, you naturally hold presence more gracefully. When you prepare for adaptation, you naturally develop confidence in your resilience. The practice of negative visualization, properly understood and skillfully applied, thus serves as a gateway to broader Stoic transformation, not through dramatic revelation but through steady clarification of what matters and how to hold what we value. It teaches us to be grateful without being fragile, prepared without being anxious, resilient without being callous. We arrive now at a place of gathering, where the threads we have been tracing throughout this long reflection begin to weave together into something we can carry forward. This is not a conclusion in the conventional sense, not a final statement that closes the door on our inquiry. Rather, it is an integration, a moment where we pause to recognize what we have learned and how these insights might continue to unfold in the days and years ahead. Negative visualization, as we have come to understand it, is not a single technique that we master and set aside. It is a practice that deepens with time, that reveals new dimensions as we continue to engage with it. The distinction between the Stoic practice of premeditatio malorum and the modern tendency toward catastrophizing is not merely academic. It marks the difference between wisdom and anxiety, between preparation and paralysis, between gratitude rooted in awareness and fear disguised as prudence. When Seneca advised his friend Lucilius to set aside certain days each month to practice poverty, to eat simple food and wear rough clothing, he was teaching something that extends far beyond those particular exercises. He was showing how voluntary discomfort, chosen deliberately and practiced with intention, can reveal to us the actual texture of our lives. This is the essence of negative visualization done right. It brings us closer to reality, not further from it. The practice asks us to imagine loss, not to obsess over it, but to see clearly what we have. It invites us to contemplate change, not to fear it, but to prepare for it with rational foresight. It encourages us to recognize impermanence, not to despair, but to appreciate more fully the presence of what is still here. This threefold movement, toward clarity, toward preparation, and toward gratitude, characterizes the practice at its best. Throughout our exploration, we have returned again and again to the question of how to engage in this practice without tipping into the very anxiety it is meant to prevent. The answer, we have seen, lies in the quality of attention we bring to it. When we visualize loss with a spirit of philosophical inquiry, with the intention to understand and prepare rather than to torment ourselves with fears, the practice becomes a source of strength rather than distress. The boundary between useful reflection and harmful rumination is real, but it is not always obvious. It requires self-knowledge to recognize when we have crossed from one territory into the other. We have explored various markers that can help us identify this boundary. The physical sensations in our body, the quality of our thoughts, the effect on our subsequent actions, the presence or absence of closure in our reflections. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journals, practiced negative visualization constantly. He reminded himself that everything he valued would eventually be lost, that the people he loved would die, that his own life would end. Yet his meditations are not exercises in morbidity. They are attempts to align himself with reality, to see things as they are rather than as he wishes they were. This alignment with reality is the foundation of Stoic philosophy, and negative visualization is one of its primary tools. The practice gains its power from paradox. By imagining loss, we appreciate what we have. By contemplating death, we engage more fully with life. By recognizing our vulnerability, we discover our resilience. These paradoxes are not logical contradictions, but experiential truths that reveal themselves through practice. As we integrate these insights, it becomes clear that negative visualization is not separate from the rest of Stoic philosophy, but intimately connected to all its major themes. The dichotomy of control, which teaches us to focus our attention on what we can influence and accept what we cannot, finds direct application in this practice. When we visualize loss, We are training ourselves to recognize what ultimately lies outside our control while preparing ourselves to respond with virtue to whatever occurs. The concept of preferred indifference, those external things that we naturally prefer but do not require for our flourishing, becomes vivid through negative visualization. Our relationships, our health, our possessions, these are all preferred indifference in Stoic terms. We are right to value them, right to care for them, right to work to preserve them, but we are not dependent on them for our essential well-being. Negative visualization helps us maintain this balanced perspective, valuing without clinging, caring without being controlled by the fear of loss. The inner citadel that Marcus Aurelius speaks of, that fortress of character and judgment that no external event can breach, is strengthened through this practice. Each time we imaginatively rehearse loss and find within ourselves the capacity to respond with wisdom and virtue, we reinforce that inner fortress. We discover that our stability does not depend on the permanence of external things, but on the quality of our own character and understanding. The practice also connects deeply with memento mori, the Stoic reminder of mortality. Indeed, the ultimate negative visualization is the contemplation of our own death. Not to become morbid or depressed, but to recognize the finite nature of our time and thereby live with greater intention and presence. When we truly internalize that our life will end, that this day may be our last, that this moment with a loved one may be our final opportunity, we cannot help but approach life with greater awareness and appreciation. But the integration we are seeking goes beyond understanding how negative visualization fits within Stoic philosophy. It extends to how this practice integrates into our actual lives, into the daily rhythms and challenges that constitute our real existence. This is where philosophy ceases to be merely theoretical and becomes practical wisdom. The practice can become a morning ritual, a brief moment of reflection before the day begins. We might sit quietly with a cup of tea and allow ourselves to imagine that this is our last day. Not with fear or dread, but with the question, how would I move through this day if I knew it was my final one? This is not about making dramatic changes, but about bringing fuller presence and intentionality to ordinary activities. Or the practice might arise naturally in moments of appreciation. When we feel grateful for something or someone, we might pause to acknowledge that this will not last forever. The sunset we are watching will end. The person we are with will eventually be gone. Our own capacity to witness and appreciate will one day cease. Rather than darkening our gratitude, this awareness deepens it, adds urgency and poignancy to our appreciation. The practice can also serve us in moments of anxiety or difficulty. When we find ourselves worried about potential losses, we can distinguish between productive negative visualization and unproductive catastrophizing. We can ask ourselves, am I preparing myself to respond well, or am I simply spinning in fear? Am I building resilience, or am I depleting myself? This metacognitive awareness itself is valuable, helping us redirect our mental energy toward more useful channels. What emerges from sustained practice is a different relationship with impermanence itself. Rather than seeing impermanence as a threat to be denied or a tragedy to be mourned, we begin to recognize it as simply the nature of existence. Everything arises and passes away. This is not a flaw in the design of reality, but its actual character. Negative visualization, practiced with wisdom, helps us make peace with this fundamental truth. This peace is not resignation or passive acceptance. It is an active, clear-eyed recognition that allows us to engage fully with life precisely because we are not in denial about its nature. When we acknowledge that everything will end, we can participate more wholeheartedly in what is present now. We can love more freely when we accept that love includes the inevitability of loss. We can create more boldly when we recognize that all creations are temporary. We can commit more fully when we understand that commitment does not mean permanence. The Stoics understood that much of our suffering comes from our resistance to change, our desire for permanence in a world of flux. Negative visualization is a practice that gradually reduces this resistance. By regularly imagining change and loss, by rehearsing our response to impermanence, we develop a suppleness of mind that allows us to move with life's changes rather than against them. This suppleness is different from detachment in the colloquial sense. We do not become cold or indifferent. In fact, many practitioners find that negative visualization allows them to love more deeply, to engage more fully, precisely because they are not handicapped by the constant unconscious fear of loss. When we have already imagined loss and prepared ourselves for it, we can be more present with what is actually here. There is a quality of freedom that comes from this practice. When we are no longer controlled by the fear of losing what we have, when we have already faced in imagination the losses we most dread, we discover a spaciousness in how we relate to life. We can make decisions based on our values rather than our fears. We can take appropriate risks rather than clinging desperately to the status quo. We can express love and appreciation freely rather than holding back to protect ourselves from future pain. This freedom extends to how we view ourselves. When we practice negative visualization regarding our own lives, our own abilities, our own future, we begin to loosen the grip of ego and self-concern. We see more clearly that the self we protect so carefully is itself temporary and changing. This recognition can be liberating rather than threatening. It allows us to take ourselves less seriously, to hold our opinions and preferences more lightly, to be more open to growth and change. The integration we are exploring is also temporal. Negative visualization creates a particular relationship with time. It brings the future into the present through imagination, not to live in the future but to be more fully present now. By contemplating what might be lost, we become more aware of what is actually here. This awareness roots us in the present moment even as we acknowledge the future's uncertainty. Similarly, the practice connects us with the past. When we imagine losing something, we often become more aware of how it came into our lives, how it has evolved, what it has meant to us. This historical awareness adds depth to our appreciation. We recognize that what we have now is the result of countless causes and conditions, many of which were beyond our control. This recognition can foster humility and gratitude simultaneously. The practice also integrates across the different domains of our lives. The resilience we build through negative visualization in one area naturally extends to others. When we develop the capacity to imagine professional loss and see that our essential self remains intact, we carry that understanding into our personal relationships. When we rehearse the loss of physical health and find internal resources that persist regardless, we discover a stability that serves us in all circumstances. This cross-domain integration reveals something important about the nature of resilience itself. True resilience is not domain-specific. It is a general capacity to meet change and difficulty with wisdom and equanimity. Negative visualization builds this general capacity because it trains us not in how to handle specific losses, but in how to maintain our center regardless of what is lost. The specifics of what we imagine losing matter less than the quality of presence and wisdom we bring to the practice. As our practice matures, we may notice that negative visualization becomes less formal and more integrated into our ongoing awareness. Rather than setting aside specific times to practice, we find ourselves naturally acknowledging impermanence as we move through our days. When we notice something beautiful, we might spontaneously recognize its transience. When we feel love for someone, we might simultaneously hold the awareness that this person will not always be with us. This is not a sad awareness, but a tender one, an awareness that intensifies rather than diminishes our experience. This integration represents a shift from practice as something we do to practice as something we are. The insights gained through negative visualization become part of our basic orientation to life. We no longer need to remind ourselves that things are impermanent. We simply know it in our bones. We no longer need to deliberately cultivate gratitude. It arises naturally from our awareness of life's fragility and preciousness. Yet, even as the practice becomes more integrated and natural, it remains valuable to return periodically to more formal engagement with it. Just as musicians continue to practice scales even after they have mastered them, we benefit from occasionally setting aside dedicated time for negative visualization. These formal sessions allow us to deepen the practice, to explore its edges, to bring fresh attention to what has become habitual. The integration we have been exploring throughout this reflection is ultimately an integration of philosophy and life. The Stoics did not present their teachings as abstract theories to be studied and discussed, but as practical wisdom to be lived. Negative visualization exemplifies this practical character of Stoic philosophy. It is a concrete practice that transforms how we experience and engage with reality. This transformation is gradual and cumulative. We do not practice negative visualization once and achieve permanent enlightenment. We practice repeatedly over time, and slowly our relationship with life shifts. We become more resilient, more grateful, more present, more free. These changes may be subtle, even imperceptible day to day, but over months and years they reshape our experience fundamentally. The practice also teaches us something about the nature of wisdom itself. Wisdom is not primarily a matter of knowing facts or understanding theories. It is a quality of being, a way of relating to experience that includes knowledge but goes beyond it. Negative visualization cultivates wisdom by training us in a particular way of seeing and responding. Through repeated practice, this way of seeing becomes more natural, more available, more integrated into who we are. As this long reflection comes to its natural rest, we might recognize that we are not so much ending as pausing. The exploration of negative visualization, like the practice itself, has no final conclusion. It is an ongoing inquiry that deepens with time and experience. What we have traced here are contours and possibilities, invitations to engage with this ancient practice in a spirit of wisdom and care. The distinction between negative visualization and catastrophizing, which we established early and returned to throughout, remains central to practicing well. This distinction is not always obvious in the moment, but as we develop sensitivity to our own mental processes, we become better able to recognize when we have crossed from one to the other. This self-knowledge is itself valuable, part of the broader Stoic project of understanding ourselves clearly. We have seen how Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus each engaged with this practice in their own way, each finding in it a source of strength and perspective. Their examples remind us that negative visualization is not rigid or formulaic. It adapts to individual temperament and circumstance while maintaining its essential character. The imaginative rehearsal of loss in service of appreciation, preparation, and resilience. The practice invites us into a more honest relationship with reality. It asks us to acknowledge what we usually prefer to ignore, that everything we value is temporary, that loss is inevitable, that our control is limited. But this honesty, far from leading to despair, opens the door to a deeper engagement with life. When we stop pretending that things will last forever, we can appreciate them more fully while they are here. This is perhaps the central paradox and gift of negative visualization, that by contemplating loss we discover abundance. Not the false abundance of endless accumulation or permanent security, but the real abundance of present awareness, of gratitude for what is actually here, of resilience that allows us to meet whatever comes with wisdom and grace. As you move forward from this reflection, the practice remains available to you. You can return to it when you feel yourself taking things for granted, when you need to build resilience, when you want to deepen your appreciation. You can adapt it to your own temperament and circumstances, finding the forms and frequencies that serve you best. The practice is a gift from the Stoics across the centuries, an invitation to live with greater awareness and freedom. The invitation is not to live in constant contemplation of loss, not to darken every moment with reminders of impermanence. It is simply to remain aware, to acknowledge the truth of change while engaging fully with what is present. This balance between acceptance and appreciation, between preparation and presence, is the art of negative visualization done right. In the end, this practice is an expression of love, love for life, love for what and whom we value, love for reality itself with all its impermanence and uncertainty. It is a way of saying yes to life as it actually is, not as we wish it were. This yes includes the no that follows all things, the eventual loss, the inevitable change. But the yes remains primary, an affirmation of the preciousness of existence even in its fragility. So we arrive at this quiet place, having traced these ideas together across many hours. The concepts will continue to unfold in your own experience, revealing new dimensions as you practice and reflect. The wisdom of the Stoics remains available, patient, waiting to be discovered anew in each generation, in each individual life. May this exploration serve your own journey toward wisdom and peace.